'Cause I want it that way. Tell me why. Hello and welcome back to another lesson in U.S. history, our final lesson for this school year. What an adventure it has been. Today we are going to finish up by talking about the presidency of George W. Bush and the events of September 11th in 2001. George W. Bush was born on July 6, 1946 in Connecticut, while his father attended Yale University. The family would then move to Midland, Texas, while George Bush Sr. got involved in the oil industry. Bush went on and got a degree from Yale and a business degree from Harvard. He returned to Midland to get back into the oil business like his dad. It was in Midland that he met and married Laura Welch, who was a teacher and a librarian. They had twin daughters, Jenna and Barbara. Bush eventually got into politics and would become governor of Texas, and at the age of 54 would become the 43rd president of the United States. It was only the second time in U.S. history that a father-son had been president of the United States. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, before them was John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And while John Adams had kind of groomed his son, John Quincy Adams, to be president, George H.W. Bush was kind of surprised when his son, W, got involved in politics. Yes, I did just refer to George W. Bush as W. George W. Bush's campaign to be president the first time in 2000 was a fascinating election year. Bush was up against the former vice president, Al Gore. For a while, it looked like Bush had a sizable lead, but eventually the gap closed. And when all the votes were in, Al Gore had won the popular vote. But the popular vote does not decide who becomes president in the United States. Each state, based upon population, is designated something called electoral votes. And if you win 50% or 51% of the votes in a state, you get all of that state's electoral votes. So once the popular votes are tallied, now the electoral votes are tallied, and it is very, very close. It all comes down to one state, Florida. And in the end, George W. Bush will win the state of Florida, securing 271 electoral votes to Al Gore's 266. And that's after Al Gore pushed and petitioned for recounts of the Florida votes. Well, they recounted them and they got the same results. And then he petitioned again, and they said, sorry, Al Gore, you do not get to be president. Bush's White House focused on this idea called compassionate conservatism, which focused on volunteerism and organized faith-based communities to help people. It embraced excellence in education as well as tax relief. In 2004, Bush was challenged by Senator John Kerry for the office of president, but Bush, in the end, would win. The legislation that would define Bush's presidency, in the early days at least, was something called No Child Left Behind. It was an education reform bill. It was passed in 2002 and was in effect up until 2015. When No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, was in effect, it affected every public school in the United States. Its goal was to level the playing field, especially for students who had disadvantages in their life, students that had economic disadvantages, students in poverty, minorities, students who were receiving services, those who speak and understand a limited amount of English. However, the restrictions and regulations NCLB placed upon schools was controversial. NCLB was intended to keep schools accountable and hold them accountable to their certain standards. The goal is equal education opportunities. And it held schools accountable in several ways. The first of which, the main one, was annual testing to see whether or not schools were teaching students and students were learning. Schools had to give statewide math and reading tests twice a year for elementary and middle school and once a year for secondary school. Schools then had to provide a report for the public to show how well their school performed on standardized testing. Now, states had to bring all students up to these standards, including those in special education. They had to be brought to proficient levels. And these schools effectively got a report card from their state on how well they were performing. And just like when you get a report card and you bring it home and your grades aren't great, your parents might say, well, now you got to face some consequences, some penalties. You're grounded for a week, a month, a year. Well, the same, not the exact same penalties, but penalties were applied to these schools that did not meet the standards. What's the version of getting grounded for a principal? You're fired. Schools who had lots of low scores on the test would be categorized as Title I schools. And if a Title I school could not meet the annual standards, the state had the authority to step in and remove the leadership team of that school, or even close the school and give parents alternative options for their children's education. Now, these goals and sanctions were supposed to push schools to improve their services and keep them accountable. And there were pros and cons when it comes to No Child Left Behind. One of the good things that came from NCLB was inclusion. NCLB set the standard that students who have learning disabilities should learn alongside their peers rather than be isolated in individual or smaller groups. Schools were pushed to give more support, attention, and help for students who had learning difficulties. And the numbers sort of speak for themselves here, because in 2002, the graduation rate for students with learning disabilities was 57%, and in 2011, it was 68%. But the negative perspective of NCLB tends to reign supreme in the conversation. I wonder what people didn't like about NCLB. Standardized test. Whoa, wait a minute. Everybody loves standardized tests. No, but this isn't about having to sit in a room for 4 hours. It's about, how learning was happening. And the issue was learning was no longer the priority of lots of schools that they'd become incentivized to teach to that standardized test. And in a way, the federal government had just decided what everyone got to learn. And anyone who wanted to learn something else besides what was on those standardized tests, well, good luck, or really tough luck. Certain penalties were criticized. The idea of firing school staff or closing a school that's struggling seems harsh to many. Critics of NCLB also pointed out several different cheating scandals as teachers and principals were pressured to do well on these tests, and so they would just, give the answers to the kids so that they did well enough to not be shut down or to get more money from the government. No Child Left Behind was supposed to be George W. Bush's legacy, the thing that he left behind that endured. All of that changed on September 11th, 2001. On September 11th, 2001, 19 militants associated with the Islamic group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes in the United States. They took those planes and carried out suicide attacks on multiple targets across the country. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers, or the Twin Towers in New York City. Another plane was flown and crashed into the Pentagon. Another plane, Flight 93, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. It's believed that this plane was intended to be flown into the White House. What I want to do now is walk through a timeline of these events as they happened and unfolded on that day, on that morning. At 8:46 a.m., United Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Towers of the World Trade Center. The impact occurred between the 93rd and 92nd floors. Hundreds of people were instantly killed, and first responders were dispatched. At 8:50 a.m., George W. Bush is about to go and speak at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, and he's informed about the first plane hitting the buildings. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower. It strikes between the 77th and 85th floor. What's shocking about this is coverage is happening about the first plane hitting, and the second plane hits live on the news. At 9:05 a.m., the president is informed of the second attack, and it's becoming clear this is intentional. The United States is under attack. At 9:32 a.m., a hijacker on Flight 93 announces to the passengers, "Ladies and gentlemen, here the captain. Please sit down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb on board, so sit." Those passengers begin making phone calls to their family, and they find out about what's happened at the World Trade Center. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon, killing 125 people. At 9:42 a.m., for the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration grounds all flights in the United States. At 9:57 a.m., the passengers of Flight 93 take a vote. They decide to try and take back control of the plane and rush the cockpit. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapses. At 10 a.m., a message is sent out to all the first responders that are still in the North Tower to evacuate. There are over 400 first responders in the building. At 10:02 a.m., the passengers of Flight 93 appear to have successfully breached the cockpit door and begun a fight in the cockpit to take back control of Flight 93. However, the hijackers decide to put the plane down. They begin a sharp descent. The plane rolls upside down and then crashes. Audio recordings have led some to believe that the passengers were able to subdue the hijackers for a time and try and get control back, although they were unsuccessful. And at 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board. The plane would have reached Washington, D.C. in about 20 minutes. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapses. 2,700 people will die at the World Trade Center complex. At 11:02 a.m., New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani orders the evacuation of all of Lower Manhattan. At 6:54 p.m., President Bush arrives back at the White House. At 8:30 p.m., President Bush addresses the nation. During the speech, he announces that terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. 3,000 people were killed in the terrorist attacks on September 11th. Citizens of 78 different countries died in New York, D.C., and Pennsylvania. That figure includes 343 American firefighters, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority officers that were trying to help people evacuate. In his speech, Bush made it clear that we will make no distinction between terrorists who commit these acts and those who harbor them. For the first time in history, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, initiates Article 5, which states that an attack on a member of NATO will be considered an attack on all members of NATO. The group known as Al-Qaeda, led by a man named Osama bin Laden, lays claim to the orchestration of the 9/11 attacks. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had their bases in Afghanistan, where they were harbored by a group called the Taliban. Operation Enduring Freedom was initiated. It was an international but American-led effort to oust the Taliban from Afghanistan and to destroy or dismantle the Al-Qaeda training bases. After 2 months, the Taliban had been removed from power. However, the fighting would continue as members of the Taliban instigated an insurgency, a war of attrition. They had moved their bases of operation to the neighboring country of Pakistan, where they continued their efforts against the United States. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the September 11th attacks, remained at large. He was finally tracked down and killed by U.S. forces, who found him in Pakistan. In 2002, the Homeland Security Act created the Department of Homeland Security. The department's job is to prevent terror attacks, to secure the border, and manage customs and immigration. An investigation was initiated by Congress, and it would become known as the 9/11 Commission, which was published in 2004. The 9/11 Commission would name Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks. Now, amidst this story, there are some questions we've got to ask. There's lots and lots of questions, but one of the most common ones has been, the planes hit the Twin Towers, and they collapsed. Why did the towers collapse? In the construction of the Twin Towers, the steel beams that held up the buildings had been coated in a fire retardant material. This was to ensure structural integrity. However, when the planes impacted the building, this fire retardant material was knocked off of the steel beams. It was then that the burning jet fuel inside the buildings began to weaken the integrity of the steel beams holding up the Twin Towers. With the weight of the tower now pressing down upon these weakened steel beams, eventually the stability of the towers gives out and they collapse. Thousands of first responders and people were exposed to toxic fumes and microparticles that had gotten into their bodies. By 2018, 10,000 people were diagnosed with cancer related to September 11th. From 2001 to 2004, $7 billion was allocated by Congress to support and compensate the families of the victims. The first memorials of the attacks came as candlelight vigils across the country. Flower tributes were placed at U.S. embassies all around the world. In Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth gave the order to play the national anthem at the changing of the guards at Buckingham Palace. The city of Rio de Janeiro put up billboards of their statue, Christ the Redeemer, embracing the skyline of New York City. For the first anniversary of the attacks in 2002, two massive beams of light were shot up into the sky where the buildings had once stood. The Tribute in Light became an annual event in New York, and on clear nights, the beams are visible up to 60 miles away. Today, there is a permanent memorial in New York City for the Twin Towers. Two reflecting ponds, with waterfalls rushing down where the Twin Towers once stood. The names of nearly 3,000 victims have been engraved into bronze panels surrounding the pools. Today, a new World Trade Center tower stands in New York City. It is called Freedom Tower, and it stands 1,776 feet tall. Okay, that is all we've got. We've covered Reagan, the 1980s, both of the Bushes, Bill Clinton, and the attacks on September 11th. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It's been an adventure. There have been highs and lows, and probably more lows than highs. Let's be real with everything that's been going on. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to continue to teach because, man, I love teaching. But I'll be honest, teaching's cool. But what I love most is all of you. One of my favorite professors used to say, I would teach for free. They have to pay me to grade. And that's kind of how I feel. But I don't want to get too emotional. I don't want you to get too emotional. Let's just end on a good note. And I just want you to know I miss you and I love you. And I mean that. Y'all are the reason I do this. I love doing this and I love you. Thank you for watching. And as always, make it a great day.